There's an implication in Mark and Matthew that compassion is something that Jesus has. Jesus brings compassion into the world. In Luke, compassion is something Jesus brings into the world, but it's something that we are supposed to have as well. That we are supposed to learn compassion, and so we get these lessons in compassion in Luke's gospel. We get two very familiar stories about people who have compassion in Luke's gospel. And what are those two stories? The Good Samaritan. The Good Samaritan has compassion. And the other one is the prodigal son. The father has compassion and invites the elder brother to be a person of compassion. That somehow we are here learning compassion.
Compassion is hard.
Compassion is hard. That's right. And Jesus brought compassion into the world, the loving kindness of God. And we are, in Luke's gospel in particular, called to learn compassion and to share it. So compassion becomes a way we live. In Luke's gospel, as I said on Sunday, it's the journey gospel. It's the story of the life of faith unfolding in the world and unfolding in us, that we have a journey through faith. Mark is an experiential gospel. It's not a journey, it's a happening. We experience it. And so compassion is something we experience. Maybe it compels us to change. We don't know. He doesn't tell that part of the story. But we experience the compassion of God in Jesus. In Luke, we experience the compassion of God in Jesus, and then we live the compassion of God with one another. And that's the Gospel of Luke and Acts. It's the compassion of God alive and at work in the world. How many times does the word compassion show up in John's Gospel? You're right, none. It doesn't show up. John uses a different word, and he uses it a lot. And love. John uses love, agape love, the unconditional embracing love of God. And it's like compassion's too hard. You know, it's a theological concept. And John isn't having it. John's saying, okay, maybe you aren't bright enough to understand what compassion is or what it looks like or what it feels like. So let's talk about love. That maybe we can get that it's really this foundational, fundamental expression of who we are as human beings. Yeah. Gut love. Yes, exactly. Compassion is gut love. The word for compassion in Greek is to have your guts engaged and to be moved. And John just says love, agape love, unconditional, embracing, forgiving, affirming love. Yes.
Does John use love instead of compassion? Because he equates it to the heart.
It could be. It could be that and John calls himself the what disciple? Beloved disciple. So John experiences the loving kindness of God as love, as maybe a movement of the heart. And that maybe it's
compassion is for many people, can be for many people. And a lot of us equate love to a certain number of people.
Say that again.
Well, compassion, we have, like Ukraine right now. We have compassion for those folks.
Mm-hmm.
But we don't have total
Love
because
me,
we don't
yeah.
know.
And so Jesus does have compassion on the crowds. in the gospel. So he does. And compassion is like an empathy engagement that you relate on a very deep human level with what someone's going through. So it may be you can have compassion, and love is a deeper, more personal, more personal connection. That may be the
I mean, you
case.
can have a lot of people that you love, but it's not the same as having compassion for an entire group of folks.
Yes. So compassion may be an umbrella that covers the crowds, and love may be a personal connection with a person, one person at a time.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. So we will take a look at compassion and anger, and we'll leave John and love for another time. We will get to love eventually, but John approaches it a little bit differently than Mark and Luke, and Matthew's kind of in the Mark train. So, and anger, not a lot of anger in the Gospels. Jesus doesn't get really angry, but we get a couple of examples of Jesus being angry.
He gets very impatient with them.
He gets frustrated with them. How long must I bear with you? How long must I be with you? Which is, incidentally, one example where a person asks Jesus to be compassionate. So there's this connection of frustration and anger and the call to be compassionate when you feel frustrated. And it's the after the Mount of Transfiguration when Jesus and Peter, James, and John come down from the mountain, and there's the man with the sick boy. And the disciples haven't been able to heal the boy. And Jesus says, how long must I bear with you that you guys still don't get it? And the father says, this is what my son goes through. Have compassion on us and help us. And Jesus, of course, does. So it's when Jesus says, how long must I bear with you? I think he's speaking to the disciples. Yes, his frustration with their not connecting, getting with the program at this point. I mean, they're on the way to Jerusalem. There isn't a lot of time left. And Jesus is wondering if they will ever wake up to the power of God that's present.
He doesn't use the phrase, you don't get it.
You don't get it. Yes. Ah. But yes, so that there's that moment of frustration and the call to be compassionate in the midst of frustration, and Jesus is compassionate. And then so we get a couple of examples of anger in Mark's gospel, and then we get Jesus at the temple in Jerusalem, where he displays, yes, it doesn't say he's angry, he just does anger. And so we'll take a look at that too. But before we do, we will say our prayers. So we start with anger, and there are only a couple of examples of anger and Jesus experiencing anger in the New Testament. That's a good compassion. Let's start with Mark chapter 3, verses 1 through 6. Mark 3, 1 through 6. And this is, there are two different words for anger in the Gospels. And this is one kind of anger, and then we'll take a look at the next lesson in Mark and see the other kind of anger and try to figure out what's the difference. So Mark 3, 1 through 6. And Laverne ventured off somewhere while I was...
Yes.
Okay, but we'll start with you, Teresa. Mark 3, 1 through 6.
Another time he went into the synagogue, and a man with a shrivel hand was there. Some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus. So they watched him closely to see if he would heal him on the Sabbath. Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, stand up in front of everybody. Then Jesus asked go on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill. But they remained silent. He looked around at them in anger and deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts, said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was completely restored. Then the Pharisees went out and began to plot with their Herodians how they might kill Jesus.
So, anger. Verse 5, after looking around at them in anger, where did the anger come from?
The Pharisees telling him he couldn't do something on the Sabbath.
So Jesus goes into the synagogue, and there's a man who's got a health issue, and a significant health issue. His arm is withered up. So he really can't work efficiently and effectively. It's impacting his life. Jesus has done some healing up to this point, and he goes into the synagogue, and there is a group of people who are watching him with the intention of what? They want to catch him, that's right, and they want to accuse him. So they are there with the predetermined purpose of wanting to catch him doing something wrong, right? So they're inclined to get evidence of Jesus doing something wrong when he goes into the synagogue on the Sabbath. And they are anticipating with this man with the withered hand that Jesus is going to heal. And instead of being on board with Jesus healing someone, they are looking to accuse him of breaking the law, healing on the Sabbath. And so Jesus calls the man forward and says to them, so Jesus calls the man forward, the man standing up in front of the crowd. How embarrassing, right? You've got an infirmity, and Jesus calls you up in front of the crowd. And then he turns to the Pharisees and says, "Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil, to save life or to destroy it?" And he knows that they are thinking of how can we trap him so that we can destroy him. So they're wanting to destroy Jesus, and they're wanting to keep Jesus from helping to do a saving act for someone who's in trouble. And they don't answer. And it's in that moment that Jesus looks at them in anger. And the word anger here is a good Bible word for anger. Or horge or horgizo, which is usually translated later on, let's say in the book of Revelation, as the wrath of God. The wrath of God. This is the wrath of God that is rising up in Jesus. And in the book of Revelation, and what does the wrath of God mean? That God's going to come wipe you out? Is this a confrontation between the Pharisees who want to destroy Jesus and Jesus who looks at them and says, "You make me so mad, I want to destroy you"? Is that the wrath of God? Or, and I think this is the general interpretation of this word for the wrath of God, is God's passion for divine justice. God's passion for divine justice, for the right thing to happen. That God's will is for the right thing to happen. Yes.
Or something I would term righteous anger.
Righteous anger. That's a good word. Yes. That there's their lack of care for the man and their desire to use an opportunity for healing as a way to undermine and destroy the ministry of Jesus. So Jesus is there to do a good thing. And instead of celebrating the goodness of God, They are working to undermine the goodness of God at work in the world. And that gives rise in Jesus to this passion for the rightness of God to be done. And the anger when people who claim to be representative of God in the world becoming impediments to God's goodness being manifest in the world. When human representatives of God in the world become impediments to God's goodness being manifest in the world, we have a problem. Does that ever happen? Yes, okay. And that gives rise to, or gives rise to the anger, the passion, saying this is not the way it should be. And clearly this is not the way it should be. And what way should it be? Jesus heals him. That's the way it should be. Healing is the way it should be.
And they should be celebrated.
And it should be celebrated that the healing power of God is at work in the world. And it should be doubly celebrated that the healing power of God is at work in the world, the very world where the people who are representing the power of God in the world are becoming impediments to the power of God in the world. And God is able to overcome that. God is able to work God's will anyway when people get in the way. And that's a beautiful thing. That is something to be celebrated. That the unbelievable self-centeredness and short-sightedness of human beings cannot thwart the goodness of God. Now that's a beautiful thing. But the issue of the representatives of God in the world, those to whom people look and say, you're a person of faith. You're someone that I can look toward to believe that God is present and at work in the world. And when those representatives become active impediments to the work of God in the world, God's passion for divine justice breaks forth and the healing goodness of God happens.
I have a question.
Yes.
Okay. Now,
Jesus was upset or the Pharisees were upset?
well,
Well, he's just saying, don't
but
let.
it doesn't matter.
Yeah, exactly. Don't let the Sabbath,
Yes.
your interpretation of the Sabbath law,
Yes.
be something that keeps people from experiencing the goodness of God.
Because in what I'm thinking, in the law of the Pharisees, you don't do any work, you don't, and healing someone
Was work, exactly. So it was doing work, and there were certain things you could do and certain things you couldn't do. And healing should be something that you can do on the Sabbath. And this man came to Jesus in the synagogue on the Sabbath because he knew he could find Jesus there. So the guy comes all that way, shows up. He knows he can find Jesus there. Jesus has been healing. And the Pharisees are essentially saying to the guy, no, not today. Come back tomorrow and be healed. And, no, now is the time. Yes, that's right. And whatever work we're able to do, and you debate what work can be done. And can we do this or can we do this? Can we do?
I keep thinking, Pharisees are self-proclaimed representatives of God.
Yes, they are self anointed, but they've done good work over time in the history of Israel. They've interpreted the scriptures, they've kept the people together and helped preserve the self-identification. They do. They have a lot of confidence and they believe they're way better at this than Jesus is and that they're the experts. And when you see the experts getting in the way, you know that you have a sense of what's happening here. That the experts are becoming an impediment to the goodness of God. And so And it says their hardness of heart. Yeah, which is a good line. He's divine passion for divine justice and their hardness of heart in Jesus heals the man. And the Pharisees go out immediately and begin plotting together with the Herodians against him, how they might destroy him. So that is one example of anger. Is that a time to be angry? Yeah, and his anger leads to what? Goodness. That's right. He's angry, but the anger leads to goodness. It leads to healing. It leads to the healing power of God being revealed for everyone to see. Which, incidentally, is the same thing that happens in the book of Revelation. When the wrath of God shows up, it doesn't destroy the world, it brings healing and redemption to the world. So that divine passion for justice that God has is a healing passion.
Is Herodians people that belong to Herod?
Yes, exactly. The Herodians are the people who are looking out to make sure that Herod's desires are being fulfilled. Yes.
It's the difference between law and justice. And the way it came down to us in America, as I was divided the party. The king and the lords were having a big argument about what kind of legal system they were going to have before the war. And the lord said, okay, you make whatever laws you want.
And so justice. So justice becomes a fundamental issue, and goodness. When do you supplant goodness and say it's not time for goodness, or it's not goodness isn't the right thing to do? There's never a wrong time to do the right thing, or never a wrong time to do the good thing. So that is one of the times when Jesus experiences anger. Another time when Jesus experiences anger is in Mark chapter 10, verses 13 to 16. And Laverne, would you be so kind as to read that?
Whoever does not receive the kingdom of God in his arms, lay his hands on them.
Okay, so Jesus is indignant. This is a different kind of anger. This is not God's passion for divine justice. This is, ah! That's the, indignant. It's interesting. This is human anger. This is very human anger. That comes from the unbelievable nature of what's happening. That I cannot get my mind around how this could be happening at this time. And Jesus isn't the only one who feels this kind of anger. In Matthew's gospel, the disciples feel this kind of anger when James and John go up to Jesus and say, we want to sit one at your right hand and one at your left hand when you come in your glory. And the other disciples hear about this and they get angry. And this is the word. I mean, the anger. I cannot believe that you would do that. Yeah, how dare you be, that way? The Pharisees also or the chief priests actually and the scribes get have this kind of anger when Jesus enters Jerusalem and the children are crying out in the temple, Hosanna to the Son of David. And they hear the children crying out in the temple, and they become indignant. They cannot believe that Jesus is allowing this to happen, that the children are singing Hosanna to the Son of David. And the chief priests and the scribes want Jesus to put a stop to it. And Jesus won't put a stop to it. That if they were silent, the stones would cry out. That there's a need to shout for the coming victory of God. And so this is a human kind of anger. And what is it that Jesus cannot believe? I cannot believe that you're doing this. What's happening? The kids are coming. The parents are bringing the kids to Jesus. And the disciples are saying no. No, that's right. The children are coming. The disciples are saying no. And Jesus is saying, I cannot believe that that's what you're doing. You ever have that experience? I cannot believe that this is what's happening. I can't believe that's the way you're thinking. I can't believe that's what you're doing. That anger.
Anointing what is perceived as unfair treatment. What Jesus is feeling is not perceived.
It is. That's right. It is now that sense of, I can't believe this is what you're doing. That they should know better. They've been with him now about 3 years. They should know better. And they think they're doing the right thing. And it may be that the Pharisees back in the synagogue thought they were doing the right thing, representing God. But when is it the wrong time to bring blessing into someone's life? When is it the wrong time to let someone know they're appreciated and affirmed for just being who they are? And when is it the wrong time to bring someone into the presence of God? And so for the church to think now's the wrong time is, Jesus says, I can't believe you. There's beautiful examples of the church getting over this problem in these very disciples, that someone comes to be baptized in the book of Acts and they respond with, I don't see any reason, I don't see any impediment keeping us from baptizing you right now. Let's get some water. And so they get it. Eventually they get it. But Jesus has anger with the way the disciples think about his presence in the world, that his presence is for the children of God right now, whenever right now happens to be. And we get in the way. So the representatives of God get in the way of the goodness of God breaking forth in the world. That's a problem. And, the people of faith are held to a higher accountability, that we claim to be believers in this. And when we get in the way, it's a problem. Jesus expects people who don't believe, who say, I'm not a follower and I don't have any part in this God business, those sinners that he hangs out with all the time. Okay, Jesus is working with them. But when you say you can see and you act as though you're blind, then Jesus has a problem with that. And so we get anger.
Well, then, children in that day and age didn't account for much.
Children were nobody. You really didn't have any status or any place in the culture. And when children were born, sometimes, the Jews named their children right away. But the pagans, yeah, we'll wait and see. Maybe you'll live, maybe you'll die, and then if they're going to be around for a while, then we'll give them a name. But the Jews believed in the gift of every life. And so there were rituals that naming was an important part of that. But, the Romans, not so much. And so children didn't have any status and didn't have any identity really in the culture.
They really needed to have a lot of children to work for the family and the, moving forward.
Yeah, if you want to have each generation carry the work of the family and the means of the family forward. But you're carrying the line forward, but it was the firstborn that got everything, and everyone else had to kind of fend for themselves. So it's the everyone else kids that, and Jesus had an issue with that. And then now we get a third example of anger. And this anger is what Jesus does specifically. And so we're in Matthew 21:12-17. And Lori, would you be so good as to read Matthew 21:12-17?
The temple courts and go at all who were buying and selling. They overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of the robbers and the lame came to him at the temple and revealed them. But when the wonderful things he did, and the children saw him in the temple courts, Hosanna to the Son of David, then they were indignant. Do you hear what these children are saying? I said, yes, replied Jesus. Have you never read? In the lips of children and infants, you, Lord, and he left them and went out of the city to Bethany, where he spent the night.
So we have another example of people getting in the way of the work of God. And who are these people? The money changers. Jesus goes into the temple. Now, are the money changers intentionally saying we are trying to impede the work of God? No. They're doing what has evolved in temple life as part of temple life. That you come into the temple, and because you couldn't use Roman coins in the temple to do anything because they have graven images on them, you would have to change your money into temple money. And everybody gets a cut. You gotta. So it's a business. They're doing business there. And then once you change your Roman money into temple money, you use your temple money to buy the animals that you're going to sacrifice. And this has a tremendous impact on poor people. If you have money, you don't change your money at the temple. You buy whatever you're going to sacrifice at the temple with the money that you have, and you bring it with you and you bring it in to sacrifice it or to offer it up as a sacrifice. And you don't have to go through the process of changing money because, you've already taken care of your commitment to bringing in a lamb or bringing in whatever it is that you're going to offer up as a sacrifice, and you bring it with you. Poor people would show up at the temple and they would change their money and then buy whatever it was that they were going to offer up as a sacrifice. Now, it's interesting that they mentioned the doves here. Who offered doves as a sacrifice in the temple? Mary and Joseph. And the reason they offered doves was because why? Exactly. They don't have enough money to buy something more expensive to offer that up. This is the most we can do with what we have. And so they do the most they can do with what they have. But what this is doing is establishing, and what Jesus says is, you've turned my Father's house into a marketplace. And so he has an issue with that. So he drives out the money changers and overturns their tables and says, my house shall be called a house of prayer, but you are making it a den of robbers. And then people come to him. They hear that he's in the temple. They come to him to be healed. And who gets mad? In verse 15, the chief priests and the scribes get mad because Jesus is doing wonderful things and the children are singing about it. And that's that same word when Jesus could not believe what the disciples were doing in keeping the children away from him. Now the chief priests and the scribes have uh, can't believe that Jesus is allowing the children to sing about the wonderful things God is doing. And so that human anger shows up, but it's not Jesus who has it, it's the temple priests and the scribes who have it. And Jesus says, let them sing. For the scriptures say, out of the mouth of babes and infants, you have brought forth praise. That this is God's thing. And so getting in the way of God, getting in the way of the goodness of God, getting in the way of the mercy of God, getting in the way of the celebration of God, Jesus has an issue with that. And that's when anger comes out. Either an anger that's fueled by God's passion for divine justice, or an anger that's fueled by, I cannot believe that's what you're doing. But at the end of each of these stories, is anger the last word? No. Anger is the word that brings you into an expression of what God is doing. So anger isn't the last word. Anger is a catalyst to bring into clarity the goodness of God. That this story doesn't end in anger, it ends in healing. This story doesn't end in anger, it ends in blessing. This story doesn't end in anger, it ends in singing. And so anger is the catalyst that brings you through to the clarity of what God is doing. And so anger is a part of the story, but it's not the last word in the story. And that is helpful for us to remember. Or do we ever get angry? And if we get angry, we have to ask ourselves, where is this anger taking us in God's story? Is it taking us to a place of healing? Is it taking us to a place of blessing? Is it taking us to a place of celebrating and singing? Because it's, and Paul will later say, you can get angry, but don't sin because of anger. Don't let anger be the last word. Anger is a human response to life in the world that takes us to the place of God. It can be destructive. When it's the last word, it can be very destructive. And when anger becomes the last word, when the Pharisees are fueled by anger and they want to destroy Jesus, that becomes their sole mission, is I want to destroy you, and anger can take you there. I mean, Jesus was absolutely human and he felt anger, but anger was the catalyst that brought him through to the clarity of what God is doing. And God does healing, God does blessing, God lifts up goodness and celebrates it. And anger can help get us there. So you think about what's happening in the war. You watch the news. You ever get angry? Angry at what's happening over there? And can we even envision the possibility of the healing of the nations coming out of this terrible, destructive, violent event? And it can, in God's will and in God's way, can that be possible? And how long?
Looking through that, you have questions, answers, and the only time when I feel like that is I just take up God's word and say, your word is good. Um,
God's word is the last word. And God wins the victory. And God has actually already won the victory. We just have to get out of our own way as human beings to experience that. The victory has been won. And it is crazy to me that 6 months ago I was on a train riding along through, uh, you know, Hungary, and that's not too far away from where all this is happening. And people are laughing, saying, "Oh, those are the old Soviet era apartments, and don't they look horrible? And these are the nice new. We're in a new day and a new way of living, and it's beautiful and hopeful, and we're going to come through COVID, and we're going to live in a hopeful time together." And now, just on the other side of their country, there's war going on. It's unbelievable. And, it's okay, God, He has heard our cries. God has heard our cries. So, do we want to stop with anger, or do we want to get into a little compassion? A little compassion. Okay, we can do compassion. Compassion is us. We're going to start in Matthew with compassion. And in Matthew and in Mark, Jesus is the one who has compassion. And it is shocking that compassion comes into the world because people are jerks. And it is, and the human need is limitless. There is no end to human need. And so if you're not a jerk, I think that's a biblical term. I think it's in there somewhere. And you have a heart for people, just the exhaustive magnitude of human need wears you down, and you get this thing that, interestingly, 2,000 years after Jesus, psychologists who have diplomas and PhDs say, you have compassion fatigue. And people have it. People get worn out and worn down from the exhaustive reality of human need. Because where does human need end? It never ends. In every human life, there's need. And human life continues to happen. And babies come into the world. And do babies have needs? Yes, every day children are born into the world and they have needs. And there are people who have to respond to those needs. And does that elevate the need level of human response? Yeah, because we were dealing with a whole world of needs and now we got more needs. And that's the truth in every family. Every family, oh, you get married and you're going to live happily ever after, and you have issues and needs to address, and you use about all the energy you have to do that. And then if you have kids, then you've got more needs and more issues. And then if you have more kids, what do you have? Less needs and no, you have more and more and more. And then you get crazy and say, oh, I want to be part of a faith community. I want to live by faith. And you come together and suddenly it's not just your family's needs. It's the family needs of everyone in community. And then it's the family needs of everyone in the world. And now we have to care about that. And so we go to therapists and they say you have compassion fatigue.
And hand me over.
Exactly. And write me a check so that you can have more issues to deal with and more needs to address. And so that is what's happening. Either people don't care and they're jerks, or they do care and it's too much. And that's why when Jesus comes and he has compassion, it's world changing. That with Jesus, it's not too much. How can that be? How can it be that when Jesus comes, it's not too much?
He's thinking with the Father.
That's right. Jesus is the Son of God. And that's his purpose, is to come and to serve a broken world, to serve a humanity in need of healing. So Let's take a look at compassion and see if we can overcome compassion fatigue. And we will begin in Matthew 9:35 to 38. And Jerry, we are with you. Mhm.
And he said to his disciples, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into his harvest field.
So Jesus is going through the cities and towns of Galilee, and he's teaching and proclaiming the good news of the kingdom. And not only is he proclaiming the gospel, but he's healing every disease and every sickness. And when he saw the crowds, he didn't say, how are we ever going to deal with this? Because once word gets out that Jesus is healing the sick, who shows up at Jesus' door? All the sick. Anyone who has someone who's sick and has gotten word that Jesus is healing those who are sick, they are bringing their sick relatives and friends to Jesus. Which tells us something, that people care for their loved ones who are sick, that there is some level of caring and compassion going on among families and friends, because people are bringing the sick to Jesus. But they're crowds to everyone else. I don't know you, and I don't have empathy or compassion for you because I don't know you. You're just part of the crowd. You're just part of that mass of humanity that has unlimited need. But when they come to Jesus, Jesus meets them personally, and he has compassion. He is moved in his guts to respond. And that's what he does. He had compassion on them. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them. And that is, underline that, because that is something that you have not seen before. Yes, Mona.
My version says that he
Moved him to pity. Yes, to,
kind
uh,
of old-fashioned.
yes, it is. Compassion is I mean, it's a good word because it means we are experiencing this suffering together. That's what compassion literally means, that I am entering into your suffering with you, but I'm not going to leave you in your suffering. I'm going to heal it. Yeah, exactly. Yes. Yeah, that I'm protected from what you're going through, but I feel badly that you're going through it. That's pity. And compassion is I'm entering into your suffering with you, and I'm not going to leave you in your suffering. I'm going to heal it. And, so that in the Christian faith, suffering is redemptive. And you think about that, people go through sickness and people go through pain and suffering and disease. And you say, why? Why would this happen? And there isn't a why in the Gospels. They don't say why. They only say that God enters into that suffering with us because it's part of the human reality. And
A doctor never asked you why.
yeah, moves us through, is with us in the suffering and moves us through the suffering. And so there are people in the world who are sick who don't get cured. But can you be healed and not be cured? Yeah, exactly. Healing is something that happens in here, in your guts. Healing is an inside the spirit reality. And so you can be healed, but not cured, which is a strange thing. but the Gospels proclaim it. And so Jesus has compassion on the crowds, and that is a very unusual response when you see a world of need. That Jesus enters into that suffering with them and heals them. And then there's this hint in Matthew saying, pray to the Lord of the harvest to send out workers into the harvest. And what's interesting is the harvest isn't talking about people believing in Jesus. The harvest is talking about people being healed from the anguish of this world. That's the harvest. That people being helped, people being healed, people having their relationships restored. So that when you have someone who's sick in your household, you become their caregiver. The relationship changes. And when you bring them to Jesus because they're sick, you are being their caregiver and bringing them as someone who loves them and cares for them. But when they're healed, are you their caregiver anymore? No. The relationship you had is restored. And now you're partners in in a relationship of mutuality. And so that's what compassion does, and that's what the harvest does, is it creates restored relationships. It brings healing. And that's the work of the life of faith. Not just do people believe in Jesus. I don't know that even comes up here. It just says Jesus heals them. And in the healing, the relationship is restored. Mm-hmm. And so that their full restoration of heart and life is that word. So they are fully restored in heart and life. And that is a good expression of compassion. And so now we jump ahead to Matthew 14, verses 13 and 14, where there is another compassion story. 13 and 14? Verse 13 and 14. So 14 verses 13 and 14. And Mona, that's you.
But it's chapter 13. No, Matthew 14. And then it's verse. Okay.
There you go.
When he heard what had happened, Jesus withdrew privately by boat to a lonely place. The people heard of it and came after him in crowds by land from the towns. When he came ashore, he saw a great crowd. His heart went out to them, and he cured those of them who were sick. When it grew late, the disciples came after him and said,
Okay, so that's good. So when Jesus heard the news, what news did Jesus hear? John the Baptist is dead. And Jesus goes away to a lonely place. So you think about this, and think about this in terms of compassion fatigue. Jesus' cousin, his friend, John, has had his head cut off by Herod Antipas. Jesus gets that news, and when you get the news that that's happened, what do? It breaks your heart, and you go away just to have some time because you can't believe that that's happened. And the anguish that you feel can't be put into words when someone you love has died that way. And Jesus, having withdrawn to a deserted place to be alone, that's why he's there, to be alone. But when the crowds heard about it, they followed him on foot from the towns. So now Jesus just wants to be alone. And the crowds show up. And he sees the great crowd that has come. And what have they brought with them? Yeah, that he had gotten into a boat to go to a deserted place, and they had gotten wind of it, so they go across to meet him there. And he comes ashore, and there's a great crowd waiting for him. And what does he do? Does he say, "Can you just leave me alone for a little bit?" No, he didn't say, "Oh, goodness." Yes, he did not row the boat the other way. He came into shore and he had compassion on them. Yes, his heart went out to them. He had compassion and he healed the sick. Healing. Is there anything Jesus can do about John the Baptist? No. It's too late. It's been done. And all he can do is go forward. But does he go forward in anger? Which is, think about that. That a horrible thing happens in his life and in his family, his cousin, the great John the Baptist, who everybody loved. This Jesus guy we're not so sure about, but John the Baptist is fabulous. Everybody loved him, and Herod killed him. And word gets around, and Jesus is in anguish and just wants to be alone. And the crowd's here, and they bring their sick to him. And even his own broken heart won't keep his heart from going out to people in need. There's nothing he can do about what happened to John, but there is something he can do for these people who are sick, and he heals them. And that's what compassion does. Compassion doesn't let the past determine the future. The painful past doesn't determine how the future unfolds.
Those people in Hungary and wherever else are displaying to the.
Exactly. People in Poland are displaying compassion for people in the Ukraine. And Poland has not had an easy go of it for the last 70 years.
Oh, no.
Or 80 years when the German army invaded. I mean, they have been through hell, and they are reaching out in compassion to people who lost.
They know.
Yeah, that's right. They know. And it is hope for what the future can be that moves them. And that is a wonderful example of how compassion works. The past can be painful, and it's happened. And we can't change what's happened. But we can, in the grace of God, go forward in hope for the goodness of the unfolding future of God and enter into that. And that's what compassion does. And now we have another compassion event. And actually, Mark tells the story too. So we're going to jump ahead into Mark. Matthew tells it in Matthew 15. Actually, before we go to Mark, let's do one more Matthew compassion story, because Mark doesn't have this one. In Matthew 20, 29 to 34, we get a wonderful compassion story. Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem. He has gone into Jericho, and he's about to make his way now up to the city. And in Matthew 20, 29 to 34, Jesus has his mind set on what is ahead. And Jeanne, if you could read Matthew 20, 29 to 34. So, we just read a story about how Jesus experienced this event and the painful past of John being killed. And that pain from something that can't be undone doesn't keep him from being compassionate. Now he's on his way up to Jerusalem, and he knows full well what's waiting for him there. He's already said it 3 times, that what's going to happen when he goes to Jerusalem. Going to be arrested, condemned, and put to death, and on the 3rd day rise. So he knows what's coming, and he's on his way up to Jerusalem. And he comes through Jericho, and what does he encounter? Going out of Jericho, a large crowd followed him, and 2 blind men were sitting beside the road. And when they heard that Jesus was passing by, they cried out, "Lord, Son of David, have mercy on us." And the crowd, what does the crowd do? No, they tell him to shut up. This is not the time. Why? Why is it not the time?
Because Jesus has more than he needs to.
Exactly, that's right. Don't you realize what he's facing? Don't you realize the future that this guy is facing? He's going up to Jerusalem, and, his death is 2 weeks away. And you are going to trouble him today? Does that keep Jesus from being compassionate? The crowds, actually, it's amazing. The crowds, who has Jesus had compassion on in the Gospel of Matthew over and over and over and over? The crowds. He's had compassion on the crowds. And now the crowds are following him, and the 2 blind men are crying out. And what do the crowds do? Shut up! Does that sound like anyone maybe we've ever known or heard of or been? That people who read this tend to think that the crowds represent the church. The crowds, the church comes to Jesus for compassion. And is Jesus compassionate? Yes, Jesus is compassionate. The crowds come to him for compassion. Jesus is compassionate and he heals. But when these outsiders who are blind and sitting by the side of the road, and they're not part of us, they're just there, when they shout out for help, what do the crowd say? Yeah, it's tough to build the bridge of compassion. But there is nothing that keeps Jesus from being compassionate. Not the pain of the past, not the fear of the future. The future is going to come. Let it come. But today there is this need. And Jesus doesn't check his calendar and say, is this something I can deal with, or is what's awaiting me too much? The fear of the fear. And you think of the people in Poland. The Russian army can come through Ukraine in time, and whose doorstep are they on? And they are not letting the fear of the future keep them from responding compassionately. Did you see this woman who stepped across the stage on the Russian news program? That's right, with the sign, "No more war." And now she's been arrested. But, I'm sure she knew full well what she was facing, and she did not let that stop her. And Jesus, knowing full well what awaits him when he gets up the hill and goes to Jerusalem, does not let that stop him. Jesus never says, "Haven't I done enough?" We say that sometimes. Haven't I done enough? Jesus never says that. There's a hymn, "Jesus, thou art all compassion." And it's true. Yeah, oh yeah, we'll have to sing that. "Love divine, all loves excelling." We sing it all the time. That's right. And it ends with "Lost in wonder, love, and praise." When you experience the boundless compassion of God, you are lost in wonder, love, and praise. It's where it brings us. But this story of the compassion of Jesus, even when the crowd say enough, does Jesus say enough? No, never. And facing the future that he knows is waiting for him doesn't keep him from responding with compassion. So now we're going to take a look at a couple of compassion stories in Mark, which are important because, Luke's gospel is the gospel of the journey. Mark's gospel is the gospel of experience. We experience this reality now in a concrete way. And the journey, who the hell knows? We don't know how this is going to work, but we know what we experience now. And so we are, with Sue, I think you're reading. Sue, you're in Mark 1, 40 and 41. Very important story in Mark's gospel. One of the first that tells us about who Jesus is.
And the leper came to him, begging him on his knees, and saying to him, if you are willing, you are able to make me clean. And he, with sympathy, reached out his hand and touched him, and said to him, I am willing, be made clean.
This is a very important story in Mark's gospel because it sums up who Jesus is and what he came to do. Mark will later have Jesus sum this all up as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many. That's the Jesus summing it up. This is the formative experience in the Gospel of Mark. And it's not the crowds. Mark will tell the stories of the crowds and Jesus having compassion on them, but not at first. The first compassion in Mark's Gospel is with a person, and it's one person. And what is the issue that this one person has? Leprosy. And what does leprosy mean in the ancient world? It means pariah, isolation, suffering, and death. That is it. You are excluded from community. The relationships that you had don't exist anymore. You are the living dead. And you are suffering, and you will die, and you will die alone. That's leprosy. And a leper comes to Jesus and makes a faith claim. If you want to, you can heal me. You can make me clean. And it's, remember on Sunday that the direction of our lives is determined by the desires of our hearts. This is that word, the desire, the wish, the will, the want to. That's what moves Jesus. That's why he's here. This is the desire of his heart. And the leper says, if this is the desire of your heart, you can heal me. And what does Jesus do? Moved with compassion. Yes, they do. Instead of compassion. Yeah. But it's the good Greek word splanchnizomai, which is compassion. Splanchnizomai. And Jesus has it. We need it. SPLANCHNIZOMAI. It means to be moved in the guts. Mark 1, 40 to 41. Splanchnizomai, moved with compassion, and this is also in Mark and very important. In Matthew, it says Jesus healed them. In Mark, what does it say? He stretched out his hand and touched him, which is actually the thing that Jesus did when they brought the children to him. He reached out his hand, and the word in Greek is this beautiful word that, have you ever been down to the coast? Down Santa Cruz, it goes Santa Cruz, Capitola, Aptos. Have you been to Aptos? Aptos is named after a Greek word, which is the coming together of two rivers or two streams. That's what aptos means, and the Greek word is haptos. Yes, so you think that that's just a Native American word or something like that. It's not. It's a Greek word which means the coming together of two streams. And that's what happens when Jesus touches this man. It's the coming together of two streams, the human need and the healing power of God. And the healing power of God enters into the man, and what leaves is one stream. Two streams come together and they leave as one stream. And that's where aptos is, and that's where this guy is. Haptos, two streams come together and it goes forward as one stream. That man's need has been transformed by the healing power of God. And that's exactly what Jesus does with the children who are brought to him to receive blessing. How much need do children have? A world of need. And they come into Jesus' presence with a world of need, and they leave in the stream of the healing, blessing power of God. Two streams come together, one stream goes forward. Exactly, touches a blind man. Two streams come together, one stream goes forward. And it's the God stream that goes forward. It's the river of God that flows forward. And you think about all the streams of each human life coming in to connect with the healing power of God and going forward as one stream. And we are all drawn together into one stream, the healing, blessing power of God. And somewhere in the Bible, it says something about the earth being filled with the knowledge of God as the waters cover the sea. All the streams converging into one. And the wonder of God is all that there is. I mean, that's beautiful. I might even write that down and remember it. Isn't that a beautiful image of who God is for the world? And for Mark, this is the foundational healing experience. Because would you touch a leper? No. And what would happen if you touched a leper? Or you would at least be unclean in community. To touch a leper is now you're unclean and you can't be in community. Does Jesus care? No. And again, two streams, one stream. Jesus is the healing power of God. It wouldn't matter. He did. He knew. And healing power of God is the stream that goes forward. It's not the leprosy stream. It's not the leprosy stream that goes forward. It's the healing power of God stream that goes forward. So that is compassion 1001 in Mark. Get this. Understand this. One person with an incurable disease that destroyed his life, and he was a living dead. And it was the desire of Jesus' heart to heal him. And Jesus didn't just say it, he touched him. It's connection, it's relationship, and now we're one stream together. It's just this beautiful image of what God does. And Mark says that's our experience of God. That's what we experience when we open our heart to God in faith, is this moment of the healing, blessing power of God that carries us forward. So
the compassion of the if you choose to.
yes, that's right. It's
if you don't want to, okay, I understand.
well, it might be more of a I know if you are the Messiah, this is in your heart, or I believe.
Yeah.
Hope against hope. That's right. A fool's hope, they say, that with nowhere else to turn, and Jesus is there. And so Mark's gospel is like you enter into this river and you have the experience, and it's like getting into an inner tube up in the Mississippi and riding it all the way down to New Orleans. And that's the life of faith, the healing, blessing power of God. It's this experience you have, and it just carries you all the way down to New Orleans. That's right. Oh my goodness. Yes, you're going through the Grand Canyon. You're riding your inner tube and you're going. Now, Luke says, yes, it is that. It is that experience. But then, when you get down to the Gulf of Mexico, you better put up a sail. And that's Luke's story, is that, yeah, okay, we have this experience. But if all it does is do something for us, then it hasn't done enough. So put up a sail and let the wind of the Spirit carry you into places you have never imagined. And that's the rest of the story. And that's why Luke says faith is a journey. Mark says faith is an experience. Which is it? Well, it's both. It's both of those things. But you ride the inner tube down the Mississippi, and then you put up a sail and let the Spirit of God, the wind of God, carry you into places that you have no idea what God has in store for you on that adventure. So that's the journey. So we have,
Mark,
yes.
I'm
Mm-hmm.
glad about this. So Jesus was a leper,
Aha.
and then the leper basically becomes his disciple.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes,
Yeah,
that,
we read on
yeah, read aloud what it says there.
way it was with a strong warning. Don't tell this to anyone. And offer the sacrifices that Moses commanded for your cleansing as a testimony to them. He went out and began to talk freely, spreading the news. As a result, Jesus could no longer enter a town openly but stayed outside in lonely places.
So Jesus tells the leper, don't tell anyone I healed you. And I could give you a nice, neat, tied up in a bow reason for that. And there are those reasons, but there's the Gospel of Mark messianic secret that we don't know why. Jesus says over and over again in the Gospel of Mark, yes, I did this, don't tell anyone. That, and we don't know why Jesus has this messianic secret. Some people think it's because people won't understand the fullness of who he is until Good Friday. So if you go out and you proclaim that I'm a healer, they're going to believe that I'm a healer, but I'm not. I'm a savior. So that there's an understanding that Jesus' saving event through the cross, people might miss it if all they're doing is looking for a healer. Uh, some people look at this event with the leper and say, well, it really has to do with a healed leper wasn't just healed because he was healed. A healed leper had to go through all these ceremonial processes at the temple to be restored into community. And so Jesus um, doesn't want this leper to circumvent the system, because if he does, he will not be welcome back into community. He has to go down and show himself to the priest and go through the process of being tested to be known in community again as someone who doesn't have leprosy. And just because Jesus healed you doesn't mean that you're welcome back into community.
You know, and I just say, Jesus sent him away with a strong warning.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yep.
that goes in.
Yeah, so that there are issues beyond this guy being healed physically. He has to be restored into community. And to be restored into community means you have to go to the temple priests and make a sacrifice and show yourself and go through a series of tests that goes over a period of time, and then they can welcome you back into community.
So would that mean if Jesus wanted him to do that, then would that be an official miracle? If he went through all these things that Jesus is asking him to do, then it would be another one that the Pharisees or whoever would say, who's Jesus?
Well, no, they wouldn't give Jesus any credit for it. They
I
would
know,
just
but
say
that
God
would
has,
make him more.
yeah, God had healed him. And so when the Jesus encounters the 10 lepers in Luke's gospel, he says to them, now go show yourselves to the priest. And, they go, and on their way, they realize that they're healed. And then one comes back and says, thank you. Yeah, no, and so it's this ritual return to community that's implied here, that just because you're healed doesn't mean you're restored into community life until you're back. Exactly. You start going out saying, Jesus did this for me. That won't count. You're still nobody, and you're still not welcome back. You have to get the priest's okay. And Jesus hadn't changed that. So there's a couple of stories in the Gospels about crowds of people who are hungry, and Jesus has compassion on them. What are those stories? The feeding of the 5,000 and 7,000. Yeah. So there are two healing stories, or feeding stories, that are compassion stories. So when people are sick, compassion is the power of healing. When people are hungry, what does compassion do? Feeds them. We read a story once upon a time from way, way back in the early history of Israel where there were hungry people and they got fed. Manna in the wilderness. And manna in the wilderness was a gift from the compassion of God. That God was entering into the suffering and the anguish of the children of Israel as they went through the desert, as they went through the wilderness. It wasn't just like God saying, here, this'll hold you. That God was saying, I am in this with you. And that we're going to come through this together. Two streams, one stream. Tired of the murmuring and the complaining. And that's what people think. But it's really a compassion story. The feeding in the wilderness is the compassion of God for a people who can't sustain themselves. And so we feed the hungry.
Don't try to save it.
Yes. Exactly. You gather up too much, it'll spoil, it'll rot. You get enough for one day. And then Jesus teaches a prayer about that. This prayer, give us today our daily bread. Provide for us, and that is entering into the compassion of God. Do we trust the compassion of God? And we have now Luke has one compassion story, and then a couple of parables that are compassion parables. But he has one compassion story, and it's not about a leper. It's not about the crowds. It's about a family. And Luke is big into family. First families we hear about in Luke's gospel are what families? Jesus' family and well, actually, we get the Mary, Martha, we get Elizabeth and Zechariah, and John the Baptist family. Yes, Jesus is big into families. And Lee, I think we are with you and with Sally in our last compassion story, which is Luke 7, verses 11 to 16. And actually, Lee, why don't you read Luke 7, 11 to 16? Luke 7, 11 to 16.
Soon afterward, he was sent to a town called Nain. His disciples and a large crowd went along with him. She was a widow, and a large crowd from the town was with her. When the Lord saw her, his heart went up to her, and don't cry. Then he went up and those carrying stood still. He said, get up. The dead man sat up and began to talk. And Jesus gave him back to his mother.
were all filled with awe and praised God.
Okay, so the story of the widow of Nain and her son who had died. Now, what's interesting is that compassion is about entering into the suffering of someone and leading them through it. This story has power for a couple of reasons. One, what woman is prominent in Luke's gospel that um, we get a lot of backstory on her and we have her being present throughout the journey with Jesus? We do get some with her, but she's more prominent in John. Mary, his mother. We get a lot of backstory on Mary, his mother, and we get Mary, the mother of Jesus, as part of the journey, the group of the women who are following Jesus all the way to Jerusalem. And did Joseph live to see the days of Jesus' public ministry? No. So Mary was what? She was a widow. That's right. And Jesus knows that the day is going to come when he goes to Jerusalem and he's going to die. And his mother is going to be in this very place, that her son will be dead. So Jesus literally has experienced what a widow goes through with his mother losing her husband. And he's lived through that with her, and he knows that. That is part of the past that he's experienced. And he knows he's going to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man is going to be arrested and condemned and killed, and on the third day rise again. And he knows what his mother is going to go through. And he sees this, and how does it impact him? Moved with compassion. His heart opens wide into the anguish of what this woman is going through. And it's interesting that the crowd is there as well. The large crowd is following. And what does the crowd do?
They were afraid.
The crowd is afraid, and the implication is the crowd's just trying to get out of the way. And Jesus stops and goes up and says to her, "Do not weep." And he went up and touched the coffin. And there's that word again. 2 streams, 1 stream. He touched the coffin, and those who carried it stopped. And Jesus said, "Young man, I say to you, arise, be raised up." And the dead man sat up and began to speak. And then this line, which is one of the greatest lines in the Bible, what does it say? Jesus gave him back to his mother. Relationship broken, relationship restored. That's the promise of God. That is the compassion of God. And it's, when the world doesn't believe it's possible, all things are possible with God. And when is the time that Jesus will not have compassion? He knows the anguish that we go through. He knows the pain of what happens when our loved ones pass away. He knows that pain, and he gives the son back to his mother. And that's not just a vision of what happened one day on the side of the road in a city in ancient Galilee. This is what happens through resurrection life. I say, be raised up. And in being raised up, relationship is restored. And that's the compassion of God. And the people glorified God, saying, "A great prophet has arisen among us, and God has come to help, to restore, to redeem his compassion." And then we get 2 parables of compassion that we know well, which are the Good Samaritan and the prodigal son. And the moral of those parables is what? Go and be compassionate. God has had compassion on you. Go and be compassionate in a broken world. Anger and compassion. What do we think? Are they real?
We have more compassion than
Anger is real. It enters into our lives, but anger is a catalyst for connecting into the healing, redeeming reality of God. Compassion fatigue.
Because somehow this
Yeah, yeah. Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. The young man. Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, we cannot carry it. Yeah, 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 yeah. It is that compassion is something that Jesus has all the time, regardless. But it's in him, not in us. We, like you said, that if we believe that we are the source, it will crush us. And if we get swallowed up by the anguish of the world, which can happen, and there are a few saints who make their way through it. Mother Teresa maybe makes her way through that anguish, but it's too much. It's too much. And try to go away. He would try to go away. People would find him, but he would try. Yeah, because this world is as beautiful as it is and as wondrous as it can be. It is a place of pain and anguish and hurt and inhumanity. And people are destroyed in it. And to see that and to experience that, to enter into it, is I'm entering into your suffering. But if I can't go through it, then I die here. Then I enter into it and I die here. We all die here. And it's going through into somehow the redemptive river of God that takes us out of it. Because if you can't envision a day when mothers and sons relationships are restored in a world right now where thousands of those relationships are ending every day in a war. Mothers won't see their sons again. They won't see their kids again. Sons won't see their mothers again in this world. And if without a faith that says there will be redemption and restoration, not in this world, but in the world to come, I mean, that pain can crush you. And it's a reality. And so we pray for the compassion of God, the healing power of God. And that's why the Lord's Prayer is really a compassion prayer. For today, get me through this. And don't let evil overwhelm me. And it is the prayer of hope. And so next week, we aren't quite in as painful a place. Next week, we are in the world of food with fasting and hunger and being together at the table. And every time Jesus sits down at the table, listen up because there's something to learn. It has to do with so much more than what's on the menu. So let's be together in a time of prayer.